The hiss of the steam engine was a dying breath, a final exhalation that left behind a silence so vast and profound it felt like a physical weight. Elara stood on the warped planks of the platform, a solitary figure against the endless, ochre-dusted plains of the Wyoming Territory. The train, her last connection to any world she had ever known, was now just a smudge of smoke on the horizon, a fading promise swallowed by the immense, indifferent sky. The dust, kicked up by the departing iron behemoth, settled slowly, coating her dark traveling dress, her gloved hands, her single, scuffed valise. It tasted of grit and finality. She had been standing here for 10 minutes. Or was it an hour? Time had become a thick, slow-moving river of disbelief. Thomas had swung down from the carriage, a charming, apologetic smile on his handsome face. "Just getting water for the journey ahead, my love. The canteen is bone dry." He'd kissed her cheek, a fleeting, cool press of lips, and strode toward the station house. She had watched him go, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt, her heart aflutter with the grand adventure he had promised. California. A new beginning, far from the whispers and debts that had haunted them in Boston. She had believed him. She had believed in the future he painted with such vibrant, confident strokes. The station house was a forlorn box of sun-bleached wood, its windows dark and vacant. A sign, creaking on a single hinge, read, "Bitter Creek Crossing." There was no town, no cluster of hopeful buildings, only this lonely outpost and a water tower that stood like a skeletal sentinel against the deepening blue of the sky. The wind began its mournful song, a low, keening sound that slipped through the cracks in the platform and chilled her to the bone. Panic, a cold and sharp-edged thing, began to cut through the fog of her confusion. He wasn't coming back. The train had whistled its departure, a shrill, impatient cry that had made her heart leap into her throat. She had scanned the platform, the station, the empty horizon, expecting to see him running, waving, that familiar smile on his face. But there was nothing. Only the wind and the vast, crushing emptiness. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a slow, sickening dread that hollowed her out from the inside. He had left her. Here. In the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a change of clothes and the rapidly dwindling warmth of the afternoon sun. The promises were lies. The adventure was a fiction. This desolation was her new reality. She sank onto her valise, the rigid frame digging into her legs, and wrapped her arms around herself. The formal posture of a lady waiting was gone, replaced by the instinctual huddle of a frightened animal. The sun bled across the horizon, setting the sparse clouds ablaze in hues of orange and violent purple. It was a beautiful, terrible sunset, a grand spectacle that cared nothing for the small, solitary tragedy unfolding below. As the last sliver of light vanished, the landscape was plunged into a stark world of shadow and starlight. The cold deepened, seeping into her marrow. Every rustle of the sagebrush, every distant cry of a coyote, sent a fresh tremor of fear through her. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then, a new sound. Not the wind, not the coyotes. The rhythmic, heavy tread of a horse. It came from the west, from the deepening gloom where the plains met the sky. A silhouette emerged from the twilight, immense and unsettling. A man on a horse, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of purpose, not haste. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it. This was the fear the other women on the train had whispered about, the wildness of this land, the dangers that lurked beyond the reach of law and society. The rider drew closer, stopping a dozen yards from the platform. He didn't dismount immediately but sat astride his powerful horse, a dark, unreadable shape against the star-dusted sky. She could make out the broad brim of a hat, the wide set of his shoulders. He seemed to be studying her, a lone piece of luggage left unclaimed on the world's largest shelf. She held her breath, willing herself to be invisible, to melt into the shadows. But there were no shadows deep enough. Finally, he swung down from the saddle. The sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth was heavy, final. He moved not with menace, but with an unnerving economy of motion, each step measured. He was tall, far taller than Thomas. As he walked into the faint starlight, she saw the weathered lines of his face, the dark stubble on his jaw, the deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the darkness rather than reflect it. He stopped at the edge of the platform, looking first at the empty tracks that gleamed faintly in the moonlight, then directly at her. His gaze was not cruel, not leering. It was something far more unnerving, it was knowing. She braced herself for a question, a demand, a threat. Instead, his voice came out low, a rough baritone that seemed to carry on the wind itself, a sound as elemental as the landscape around them. He spoke 2 sentences that shattered her understanding of the world, that turned her abandonment into something else entirely. "The train is long gone," he said, a simple statement of fact. Then, after a pause that stretched for an eternity, he whispered, his voice carrying an impossible weight of certainty, "I've been waiting for you." The words hung in the frigid air, incomprehensible and terrifying. Waiting for her? How could anyone be waiting for her in this godforsaken place? No one knew she was here. She barely knew herself. The man's stillness was absolute, a stark contrast to the frantic chaos in her mind. He was a predator, she thought, a wolf who had scented her fear. He was toying with her. Or perhaps he was mad, a lonely specter haunting this desolate outpost. She clutched her valise tighter, its handle the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare. Her voice, when she found it, was a thin, reedy thing, a pale imitation of her own. I don't know you. You've made a mistake." He didn't reply immediately. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. The moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the shadow beneath his brow. He seemed carved from the very rock and hardship of the land itself. "No mistake," he said at last, his voice just as quiet, just as certain. He made no move to come closer, yet his presence filled the entire platform, pressing in on her. He gestured with his head, a slight, economical movement, towards a faint, flickering light some distance away. "A lamp in a window. It's cold. There's a fire." It was not an invitation. It was a statement of the next logical step, as if her following him was an inevitability he had settled long ago. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but where? Into the vast, dark plain, filled with unseen dangers and the certainty of freezing to death before dawn. Her choices had been stripped away, one by one, until only this remained, the terrifying stranger and his offer of fire. Shaking, propelled by a will that was no longer her own, she rose to her feet. Her legs were stiff, her body aching with cold and tension. She picked up her valise, the weight of her former life contained in the small leather box. He waited patiently, his silence a form of pressure more potent than any command. He turned and began to walk towards the light, his long, steady strides eating up the ground. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. She had no other choice. Her boots scuffed in the dirt as she hurried to keep up, the valise bumping against her leg. The cabin was small, a rough-hewn structure of dark logs chinked with mud. It looked as though it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin, gray ribbon against the black sky. The man pushed open the heavy wooden door and stood aside, holding it for her. The gesture was one of ingrained courtesy, a stark and confusing contrast to the intimidating figure he cut. She hesitated at the threshold, peering into the dim interior. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, leather and dust and the faint, clean scent of pine. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a small, well-behaved fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows across the single room. It was Spartan, stripped of all but the most essential items, a sturdy table and 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, shelves holding a few tins and books, and a rifle resting against the wall by the door. It was a place of solitude, of survival. He stepped inside after her, closing the door and shutting out the mournful wind. The sudden quiet was almost as deafening. He moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames leaped up, illuminating his face more clearly. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, but his face was weathered far beyond his years. There were lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a scar, thin and white, that cut through his left eyebrow. He ladled a thick, dark stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a tin bowl and set it on the table. He pushed a spoon beside it. "Eat," he said. It was another command disguised as a suggestion. She sat, her movements stiff and awkward. She was too terrified to be hungry, yet the warmth of the bowl in her hands was a comfort, a small anchor in the storm of her fear. She took a tentative spoonful. It was venison, rich and savory. She ate slowly, mechanically, her eyes darting around the small space, taking in every detail, searching for a clue to the man who inhabited it. He did not eat with her. He stood by the fire, nursing a tin cup of what she assumed was coffee, his back partially to her. He seemed content to exist in the silence, a man accustomed to his own company. He was a puzzle of contradictions, his presence was immense and threatening, yet his actions were considerate. He had offered her shelter, fire, food. He had not touched her, had not spoken a cruel word. When she finished, he took her bowl without a word and rinsed it in a bucket of water. He then gestured to the cot in the corner. "You can sleep there." He took a worn bedroll from a hook on the wall and spread it on the floor for himself, positioning it between her and the door. A silent guardian, or a jailer. She couldn't tell which. She lay down on the cot without undressing, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. The straw-filled mattress rustled beneath her. She watched him through slitted eyes as he sat by the dying embers of the fire, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, practiced movements. He was a man of immense and quiet capability. And he had been waiting for her. The thought sent another shiver of fear through her, but it was now mingled with a spark of desperate curiosity. Who was this man? And why, in this desolate corner of the world, was his fate so inexplicably tangled with her own? Elara woke to a world remade in the pale, fragile light of dawn. The cabin was cold, the fire in the hearth reduced to a bed of glowing orange embers. Her mysterious host was gone. For a wild, hopeful moment, she wondered if he had been a phantom of her fear-addled mind, a product of the night. But the empty tin bowl on the table, the scent of wood smoke still clinging to the air, and the indent of his body on the bedroll by the door were proof of his reality. She sat up, the coarse blanket scratching her chin. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her. She had survived the night. It felt like a monumental achievement. Pushing herself off the cot, she walked to the cabin's single window. Outside, the landscape was no longer a terrifying void but a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. The plains rolled away to the horizon, a tapestry of muted greens and golds under a sky streaked with pink and lavender. The air was so clear it seemed to magnify the distance, making the faraway hills look close enough to touch. She saw him then. He was by a small corral behind the cabin, tending to his horse. He moved with the same quiet grace she had noted the night before, his hands gentle but firm as he brushed the animal's dark coat. The horse, a magnificent creature, nudged his shoulder with affection. There was a connection between them, a silent understanding that spoke of years of shared hardship and companionship. Seeing him in the clear light of day, stripped of the night's menacing shadows, did little to solve the puzzle he presented. He was still formidable, his frame lean but powerful, but there was a deep-seated weariness in the set of his shoulders, a solitude that seemed as much a part of him as his weathered skin. Summoning a courage she didn't know she possessed, Elara pushed open the cabin door and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp and cold, a clean, invigorating shock to her system. He heard the door creak and turned his head. His eyes, the color of slate, met hers across the yard. There was no surprise in them, only a calm, steady assessment. He gave a short, single nod of acknowledgement before turning back to his horse. The gesture, small as it was, felt significant. It was a recognition of her presence, an acceptance of her place in this strange new reality, at least for now. She walked to the water pump near the cabin, her city shoes ill-suited for the uneven ground. She worked the handle, the rusty metal groaning in protest, until a stream of icy water gushed out. She cupped her hands and drank, the cold liquid a balm to her dry throat. When she looked up, he was standing nearby, holding a tin coffee pot. "The next eastbound train is in 3 days," he said, his voice as rough as granite in the morning quiet. "Westbound, a week." He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't ask about Thomas. He simply laid out the facts, stark and unadorned, leaving her to grapple with their implications. A week. An entire week in this wilderness, under the care of this silent, watchful stranger. The thought should have terrified her, but strangely, the sharp edge of her fear had been blunted, replaced by a weary resignation. The world had already fallen apart. What was one more week in the ruins? "I have no money for a ticket," she confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was a humiliating admission, laying bare the totality of her abandonment. He considered this for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Work," he said, the single word a solution, not a judgment. "There's always work." He handed her a bucket. "The well needs filling. After that, the mending." He nodded towards a pile of burlap sacks and a horse blanket in need of stitching. The tasks were simple, menial, yet they felt like a lifeline. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering a trade. Her labor for her keep. It was a harsh bargain, but it was an honest one, and in that honesty, she found a strange sliver of dignity. As she carried the first heavy bucket of water back to the cabin, her muscles straining, she began to understand. This man, Silas, she had heard him murmur the name to his horse, dealt in realities, not illusions. Thomas had woven a world of beautiful lies. This man offered only the hard, unvarnished truth. The water was heavy. The mending would be tedious. The sun would be hot, and the nights would be cold. But it was real. For the first time since the train had pulled away, she felt the ground beneath her feet. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the fundamental needs of survival. Elara worked from dawn until dusk, her soft hands quickly becoming chapped and calloused. She fetched water, mended clothing, tended the small, struggling garden behind the cabin, and learned to cook over an open fire. Each task was a small victory against the despair that threatened to consume her. The physical exhaustion was a blessing. It quieted the relentless churn of her thoughts, the haunting echoes of Thomas's betrayal. Silas worked alongside her, though rarely with her. He was a whirlwind of silent, ceaseless activity. He repaired the corral fence, hunted for game, chopped firewood, and spent hours riding the perimeter of the small plot of land he called home, his rifle always resting in the scabbard on his saddle. They moved around each other in a carefully orchestrated silence, two solitary planets orbiting the same small star of the cabin. The silence was not empty. It was filled with observation. Elara watched him, learning his habits, the language of his movements. She saw the way he tested the wind before a hunt, the meticulous care with which he cleaned his tools, the brief, unguarded moments when he would stand staring at the western horizon, his face a mask of profound and ancient grief. She noticed a small, worn book on his shelf, a collection of poetry, its pages filled with pressed wildflowers. It was a jarringly tender object in this world of harsh masculinity. Inside the front cover, in faded, elegant script, was a woman's name, Anna. Beside it, tucked into the spine, was a small, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with his same slate-gray eyes and a gentle smile. His sister. His wife. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken. Her internal world was a tempest. The memory of her husband was a wound that refused to close. She replayed their life together, searching for the signs she had missed. Thomas, with his easy charm and expensive tastes, had always been a gambler, not just with cards, but with their future. He had promised her a life of ease and prosperity, a stark contrast to her austere upbringing as a clergyman's daughter. She had been so captivated by the dream he sold that she had willingly ignored the cracks in its foundation, the hushed arguments with creditors, the sudden, unexplained trips, the desperation that flickered in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She now understood with chilling clarity that he hadn't just abandoned her, he had discarded her. She was a weight, a complication he had shed in order to travel faster and lighter towards his next gamble. The thought was a bitter pill, but as the days wore on, the bitterness began to transform. It curdled into a hard, cold anger. An anger at him, but also at herself, at her own willful blindness, her own naive belief in fairy tales. One afternoon, while she was scrubbing a pot by the well, she saw him return from a ride. He dismounted and began to unsaddle his horse, his movements weary. He paused, his hand resting on the animal's neck, and looked over at her. "You learn fast," he said. It was the first compliment he had ever paid her, if it could be called that. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, but it landed in her chest with surprising warmth. "I had to," she replied, her voice steady. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a shared understanding of necessity. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his gaze. He then looked towards the long, dusty track that served as a road. "Storm's coming," he said, though the sky was a perfect, cloudless blue. He was not talking about the weather. He was a man who lived on the edge of a blade, and he could feel when the air was about to change. He was teaching her to feel it, too. That night, she didn't just see him as a mysterious stranger. She saw him as a fellow survivor, a man who had his own ghosts, his own desolate station in the wilderness of the world. And in that shared solitude, the first, fragile tendril of trust began to take root. The storm Silas had predicted arrived not in the sky, but on horseback. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the plains, when the sound of approaching riders broke the day's quiet rhythm. There were two of them, their figures wavering in the heat haze. They were not travelers passing through, they rode with a swaggering, purposeful arrogance that set Alara's teeth on edge. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a post, and she froze, a wet shirt clutched in her hand. Silas emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been cleaning his rifle. He didn't look at her, but she felt his presence as a sudden, solid wall at her back. He simply stood on the porch, watching the men approach, his body relaxed but radiating a coiled stillness that was far more intimidating than any overt threat. The men reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, kicking up a cloud of dust. They were rough-looking, with sun-scorched faces, grimy clothes, and pistols holstered low on their hips. The lead rider, a burly man with a thick, untrimmed beard and small, piggish eyes, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. His gaze swept over the small homestead with contempt before settling on Alara, a leering, possessive look that made her skin crawl. "Well now, Cobb," the man said to his companion, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Look what the cat dragged in. Didn't know you'd taken on a housekeeper, Stone." He directed the last part at Silas, his tone dripping with insinuation. Silas remained silent, his face impassive. His lack of response seemed to irritate the man. "Blackwood's been asking about this plot. Still thinkin' on his generous offer." "It's not for sale," Silas said. His voice was quiet, dangerously level. The man, Cobb, chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Everything's for sale, Stone. Just a matter of finned in, the right price." His eyes slid back to Alara, lingering on her face, her hands, the shape of her body beneath the simple dress. "Or the right, collateral." The implication was ugly and unmistakable. Alara felt a surge of cold fury, so potent it momentarily eclipsed her fear. She was not collateral. She was not a bargaining chip. She was a person. The second rider, younger and lankier, shifted nervously in his saddle. He seemed to sense what his companion did not, that they were treading on treacherous ground. Silas took a single, deliberate step forward, moving off the porch and onto the dirt. He positioned himself squarely between the men and Elara. He still hadn't raised his voice, still hadn't reached for a weapon, but the shift in his posture was dramatic. The lazy relaxation was gone, replaced by the lethal focus of a wolf about to strike. The air crackled with unspoken violence. "You've said your piece," Silas stated, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "Time to ride on," the bearded man bristled, his hand inching towards the butt of his pistol. "You gettin' mighty bold for a man with nothin' left but dirt and bad memories, Stone." Silas didn't even glance at the man's hand. His gaze was locked on the man's eyes, a look of such chilling intensity that Elara could feel its power from 10 feet away. "Ride on," he repeated, and this time, it was not a suggestion. It was an order, backed by an absolute certainty that it would be obeyed. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corners of the cabin and the nervous stamping of a horse. Then, the bearded man seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of Silas's stare. He broke eye contact first. With a curse, he yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. "This ain't over," he snarled, though the threat had lost its venom. "Blackwood gets what he wants." Always, they galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and a heavy, ringing silence in their wake. Elara finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the wet shirt. She looked at Silas. He was still watching the riders disappear, his body slowly uncoiling from its state of high alert. He had protected her. He had stood as a shield between her and that ugliness, without hesitation. In that moment, her fear of him vanished completely, burned away by a flare of profound, startling gratitude. He was not her jailer. He was her guardian. That evening, the fragile piece of their routine was shattered. The encounter with the two men had left a stain on the air, a lingering tension that the setting sun could not erase. They ate their meal in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, freighted with unanswered questions. The unspoken things between them had become too large to ignore. After they had cleared the table, Elara sat by the hearth, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the flames. Silas stood by the window, staring out into the darkness as if he could still see the dust of the departed riders. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was steady, infused with a new resolve she had found in the crucible of the afternoon's fear. "Who is Blackwood?" she asked. Silas didn't turn around. For a long time, she thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled, a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with memory. "He's a vulture. A man who thinks money gives him the right to own the land, the water, the people on it." He turned from the window, his face etched in shadow and firelight. "This place, this was my family's. My father built this cabin with his own hands. We had a small ranch, a good well. We weren't rich, but we were free." He paused, the pain of the memory raw in his voice. "Blackwood wanted the water. He offered my father a price that was an insult. When he refused, Blackwood's men started cutting our fences, spooking our cattle. One night, there was a fire in the barn. My father, he didn't make it out." The story was delivered in stark, clipped sentences, each word a hammer blow of grief. "My sister, Anna, and I left. There was nothing for us here but ash. I came back a year ago. To reclaim what's mine. To make sure no one forgets what he did." He looked at the worn book of poetry on the shelf. Anna. The woman in the photograph. His sister. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of a man forged in loss and driven by a fierce, protective loyalty to his past. Elara absorbed his story, her own sense of betrayal resonating with his loss. She understood now the source of his solitude, the reason he guarded this desolate patch of earth with such quiet ferocity. It wasn't just land, it was a legacy. It was a grave. Then, she asked the question that had haunted her since she'd first arrived, the question that underpinned the entire impossible situation. How did you know I would be here? Why were you waiting? Silas walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He opened it and took out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to her without a word. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was a letter, the handwriting immediately, sickeningly familiar. It was Thomas's elegant, sloping script. She read the first few lines, and the world tilted on its axis. The letter was addressed to a Mr. Jedediah Blackwood. It was a business transaction. Thomas, mired in gambling debts he could never hope to repay, was offering a settlement. He wrote of his wife, of her good breeding, her obedient nature, her strong constitution. He was describing her as one would describe livestock. The terms were brutally clear. In exchange for clearing his debts and providing him with a small stake to continue west, Thomas would deliver his wife to the Bitter Creek crossing station. She was to be handed over to Blackwood's men, to be used as a housekeeper and companion at his remote ranch. Payment. She was the payment. The valise, her meager belongings, the very dress on her back, it was all part of the sale. I found one of his couriers, Silas explained, his voice devoid of emotion. He was carrying this. I knew they were coming to collect someone. I didn't know who. I just knew I couldn't let Blackwood take another person from this place. The air left Alara's lungs in a pained gasp. It wasn't a random abandonment. It was a calculated, cold-blooded sale. She had not been left behind, she had been sold. The humiliation was a physical blow, followed by a white-hot rage that burned away every last tear, every trace of the weeping, helpless woman she had been. She looked up from the letter, her eyes dry and blazing. She met Silas's gaze, and in his slate-gray eyes, she saw not pity, but a reflection of her own hardening resolve. He hadn't been waiting for her. He had been waiting to stop a crime, to stand against the darkness that had once consumed his own life. By chance, by some cruel twist of fate, she was the person he was there to save. The revelation of Thomas's letter acted not as a crushing weight, but as a clarifying fire. The woman who had arrived at Bitter Creek Crossing, the frightened, naive wife from Boston, was incinerated in the blaze of her own fury. In her place, someone new was being forged, someone harder, more resilient. The grief for the life she had lost was replaced by a grim determination to build a new one, here, on this unforgiving soil that had already witnessed so much of her undoing and her remaking. She looked at Silas, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. He was no longer just her protector, he was her only ally in a world that had suddenly become a battlefield. I am not his property, she said, her voice low and vibrating with an intensity that surprised even herself. She crumpled the letter in her fist, the paper crackling in protest. I will not run. I will not be collected. A flicker of something, surprise, admiration, crossed Silas's face. He had expected her to crumble, to want to flee on the next train east. He had not expected this raw, defiant strength. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Blackwood won't give up easily. He sees you as an investment now. An insult to his power, then we will be ready for him, she stated. It was not a question. It was a declaration of war. And so began a new phase of her existence at Bitter Creek. Her education in survival intensified. The next morning, Silas took the rifle from its place on the wall. It was a heavy, long-barreled Winchester. He led her out to the plains, set up a line of empty tins on a fence post 50 yards away, and pressed the cold, heavy weapon into her hands. You need to know how to use this, he said simply. I can't be everywhere at once. The rifle was heavier than she could have imagined, its wooden stock awkward and alien against her shoulder. Her first shot, deafening and jarring, went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to the left of the targets. The recoil slammed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder, a brutal, punishing force that made her cry out. Again, Silas said, his voice calm and steady behind her. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Day after day, they practiced. Her shoulder bloomed with a dark, ugly bruise. Her arms ached from the weapon's weight. But she did not complain. With each shot, she channeled her rage, her humiliation, her grief, into the act. She imagined Thomas's smiling, treacherous face, Blackwood's leering eyes. Slowly, painstakingly, her aim improved. A tin would ping, then another. The satisfaction of hitting her target was a visceral, empowering thrill. It was the first time in her life she had ever felt truly capable of defending herself. Their training was not limited to the rifle. Silas taught her to track, to read the subtle signs left in the dirt by man and animal. He showed her how to move silently through the sagebrush, how to use the terrain for cover. He was a patient, exacting teacher, communicating more through gesture and demonstration than through words. In these lessons, the space between them shrank. They were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance, but partners in a shared, dangerous enterprise. The long silences were now punctuated by brief, meaningful conversations. He told her about Anna, about her love for books and her dream of being a teacher. She told him about her father, the stern but loving clergyman, and her quiet, ordered life before Thomas had swept her up in his whirlwind of false promises. They were piecing each other together, finding common ground in their shared histories of loss. One evening, as she was cleaning the rifle and he was sharpening a knife by the fire, she looked at him. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked up, his hand stilling. "For what?" "For not seeing me as something fragile. For believing I could learn." He held her gaze for a long moment, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "I never saw fragile," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I saw a survivor. You just didn't know it yet." In his words, she felt a sense of recognition, of being truly seen, that she had never known before. He was not just teaching her to fight an external enemy, he was helping her defeat the internal one, the voice that told her she was weak and helpless. The storm he had predicted was still coming, but she was no longer afraid. She would face it standing, with her feet planted firmly on the ground she now intended to claim as her own. The sky on the seventh day was a bruised, turbulent canvas of gray and purple clouds. A hot, dry wind whipped across the plains, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a day for endings and beginnings. They knew Blackwood was coming. The land itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Silas had been gone since dawn, riding a wide circle around the homestead, scouting. He returned at midday, his face grim. "They're coming." 4 of them, including Blackwood himself. He dismounted, his movements economical and precise. There was no fear in him, only a sharp, deadly focus. "They'll come from the east, using the low ridge for cover." He looked at Alara, his slate-gray eyes searching hers. "You remember what to do?" She nodded, her heart a steady, heavy drum in her chest. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. This was her home now. This man was her partner. She would not let Blackwood take either of them. They spent the next hour making their final preparations. Silas barred the heavy window shutters, leaving only a narrow slit for a rifle. He positioned a second rifle, loaded, by the window for her. He placed buckets of water near the door, in case of fire. Alara moved with him, her actions mirroring his, a silent, efficient dance of two people working as one. She secured the latch on the door, checked the ammunition, and laid out bandages and a bottle of whiskey on the table. When all was done, they stood in the dim light of the cabin, the world outside strangely silent except for the rising wind. "Alara," Silas said, his voice unusually soft. He reached out and touched her arm, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Whatever happens, you are not what he tried to make you. You are not a debt to be paid." She looked up at him, at the fierce loyalty in his eyes, and felt a surge of strength. "I know," she said. And she did. The riders appeared just as Silas had predicted, 4 dark figures emerging over the ridge, moving slowly, deliberately, their arrogance a palpable force even at a distance. They spread out, forming a loose semicircle as they approached the cabin. Elara took her position at the window, the Winchester stock cool and solid against her bruised shoulder. She lined up the sights on one of the riders, just as Silas had taught her, her breathing slow and even. Silas stood by the door, his own rifle held loosely in his hands. The four men reined in their horses 30 yards out. The man in the center, broad and imposing in a black duster, was clearly Blackwood. He had a cruel, fleshy face and eyes like chips of obsidian. "Stone," he boomed, his voice carrying over the wind. "You've had your week. I've come for my property. Send the woman out, and I might let you live on this pathetic scrap of dirt." Silas stepped out onto the porch, a solitary, defiant figure. "She's not your property, Blackwood. And this is not your land. Turn around and ride away." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Brave words," he nodded to one of his men, the same bearded ruffian from before. The man raised his rifle. The world seemed to slow down. Elara saw the glint of the sun on the man's rifle barrel. She saw Silas begin to move. She did not hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The cabin filled with the deafening roar of the shot. Outside, the bearded man cried out, dropping his rifle as he clutched a shattered shoulder. The sudden, unexpected attack from the cabin threw them into chaos. Blackwood's horse reared in panic. Silas used the moment, firing his own rifle. Another rider tumbled from his saddle. It was a maelstrom of noise, dust, and violence. Blackwood, roaring with rage, dismounted and charged towards the cabin, firing his pistol wildly. Bullets splintered the wood of the doorframe near Silas's head. Elara reloaded, her hands moving with a practiced sureness she hadn't known she possessed. She fired again, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back. Her shot kicked up dirt at Blackwood's feet, forcing him to dive for cover behind the water trough. The fight was brutal and close. Silas moved from the porch, using the corner of the cabin as cover, exchanging fire with the remaining rider. Elara kept Blackwood pinned down, her shots precise and disciplined, preventing him from getting a clear line of sight on Silas. They were a team, a well-oiled machine of survival. Then, a searing pain erupted in Silas's leg. He grunted, stumbling back against the cabin wall, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. The last rider, seeing his chance, spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol for a final shot. From the window, Elara saw it all. Time stopped. There was no thought, only instinct. She fired. The rider was thrown from his horse, landing in a heap on the dusty ground. Seeing his men fall and his advantage lost, Blackwood let out a final, frustrated curse. He scrambled back to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and fled, a coward in the end. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was over. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke. Rain began to fall in heavy, cleansing sheets, turning the dust to mud and washing the blood from the hard-packed earth. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, was slowly purified. Inside the cabin, Elara knelt beside Silas, her hands gentle but firm as she cut away his torn trousers. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was a painful wound, but not a fatal one. Her fear had receded, replaced by a calm, focused efficiency. She washed the wound with whiskey, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, and bandaged it tightly with strips of clean linen. Her movements were sure, her touch steady. The woman who would have fainted at the sight of blood a week ago was gone forever. He watched her, his face pale and tight with pain, but his eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. It was a mixture of gratitude, awe, and something deeper, something tender and profound. When she was finished, she helped him to the cot, her slight frame surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. He sank onto the mattress with a weary sigh, the tension finally leaving his body. The rain drummed on the roof, a soothing, steady rhythm. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken in the thunder of rifle shots, in the shared danger, in the simple, trusting act of her tending to his wound. She had not only saved his life, she had saved his home, the legacy he had fought so hard to protect. And in doing so, she had claimed it as her own. The night passed in a state of peaceful, shared exhaustion. She sat in a chair by the fire, watching over him, dozing fitfully. The ghosts of the battle, of Thomas, of her old life, seemed to have been washed away by the rain. All that remained was this small, warm cabin and the quiet, breathing presence of the man on the cot. The new dawn broke clear and bright, the world scrubbed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and sage. Elara stepped outside, breathing it in. The bodies of Blackwood's men were gone. Silas, despite her protests, had dragged them away during the night, unwilling to let death mar this place. He was sitting on the porch steps, his wounded leg propped up, cleaning his rifle with the same meticulous care as always. He looked up as she approached, and a faint, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft. She sat beside him on the steps, not too close, but near enough that their shoulders almost touched. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, its warmth chasing away the last of the night's chill. The vast, empty plains that had once terrified her now looked like a promise. It was not a land of desolation, but a land of possibility, a blank page on which a new story could be written. "Blackwood won't be back," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Men like him prey on the weak. They don't fight wars they can't easily win." He was right. They had shown him they were not weak. They had shown him they were a force to be reckoned with. "What will you do now?" he asked, turning his head to look at her. His eyes were clear, his question genuine. The eastbound train was due in 2 days. She had earned her passage. She could leave. She could go back east, try to piece together some semblance of her old life. The thought held no appeal. It felt like trying to put on a dress she had long outgrown. Her old life was a ghost story, a tale told about someone else. She looked out at the endless horizon, at the raw, rugged beauty of the land. She thought of the hard work, the shared meals, the quiet companionship. She thought of the man beside her, the silent guardian who had shown her the strength she never knew she possessed. She had been brought here as a prisoner, left as a victim. But she would stay as a partner. "I think," she said, a slow, real smile spreading across her face, "that the garden needs weeding. And that fence won't mend itself." Silas's gaze softened. The last walls around his heart seemed to crumble. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He understood. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the wooden step. His touch was warm, solid, a silent confirmation of a pact already made. Here, at the end of the world, she had not been destroyed. She had been found. Being left behind at the station had not been an end. It was the beginning of everything.